welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I go through the letters to the editor in my local newspaper, the West Australian, and I criticise the stupid people who write in stupid things. First letter. The Panel of Plenty, 2nd of July 2014. Is it not possible for the government of the day to put in place some mechanism that would override the determinations of the Salaries and Allowances Tribunal? Peter Rob Morley. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, here in Western Australia, and I think actually the entirety of most of Australia at least, our parliamentarians, our elected representatives, don't set their own salaries. There's an independent body called the Salaries and Allowances Tribunal that each year reviews their salaries and almost always recommends a pay rise. And this is always controversial, and people always say that the politicians should refuse the pay rise or something such like that. And so what the letter writer is asking is, surely the politicians can do something about that? And the answer is, of course, they can. The Salaries and Allowances Tribunal was initially set up so that politicians weren't making their own pay decisions. It was widely recognised by basically everybody that politicians had a conflict of interest if they were setting their own salaries. But basically, being the highest lawmakers in the state, they have the power to set their own salaries. And so they delegated that power to an independent body that sets them for them. The problem is that there is always cost of living increases. So every year there's always a couple of % rise, no matter what. Just as a matter of course. And then usually the guidelines that the tribunal follows is to match essentially what industry is offering. The idea being that our parliamentarians should be representative of, a top 20% of the population or so. That's who we should be attracting to these positions. That, broadly speaking, being the top lawmaker in the state should be equivalent to being on the board of a largish company or something like that. And so the salaries should be kept in line with that. Western Australia has been doing well, and even in bad times, those salaries tend to go up small percentages. And so, the politicians' salaries go up steadily, and this is never popular. So it's a bit of a double bind, and I've not actually seen a good suggestion about how to deal with this. If you give the powers to an independent body to do it on a reasonable basis, they are going to suggest you get a pay rise. If you don't, and you do it yourself, you will never be able to give yourself a pay rise, no matter how well deserved it is, because it will never be popular. And as far as I can tell, in my years of watching politics, state and federal, the vast majority of parliamentarians are in it because they want to make the world a better place and think they are honestly doing the best thing. A lot of them are eminently qualified to be there. Most of them, or a great many of them, could earn more money elsewhere. That's another thing that's often missed, is that most of the politicians we have come from businesses or unions or something like that, and usually take a pay cut to go into Parliament. And so it's not like these pay rises are what's keeping them in their job. They're in there because they want to be there. And so it's a bit rich to say that they're getting overpaid when they're generally, as I say, the salaries are being set by an independent body and they're set, in line with everybody else's salaries, and most of them taking pay cut to be there. So if you can think of something that's better, that's not just some kind of knee-jerk political, politicians shouldn't get paid anything kind of system, then, feel free to suggest it. Maybe somebody will listen. Mystery of MH370, 4th of July 2014. If, as has been suggested, there was a conspiracy in the cockpit to ditch Malaysia Airlines flight MH370, which was flying at an altitude of about 11,000 metres and was low on fuel, then the plan could have been to conserve fuel by reducing engine thrust with nose down to maintain airspeed on a southwesterly course towards Antarctica, in such a desolate and isolated area that would make discovery difficult. G.R. Williams, Wanneroo. I love this. Week after week, people are still writing in their letters about the MH370, the Malaysian Airlines plane that disappeared several months ago, with their conspiracy theories about where or when it's gone down, who's in charge of it, whether it crashed, whether it was a terrorist attack, whether it was something. And every single one of them have no idea what they're talking about. To be honest, as far as I can tell, they don't seem to have any idea. The experts don't have any idea. And I just love that, uneducated armchair people feel strongly enough about it, or so feel so convinced that they've got the secret that they write in letters to the editor. That's one thing I love about them. Okay, next two letters together are about Rolf Harris. A Shameful Secret, 2nd of July 2014. So Rolf Harris was known in media circles for decades as the Octopus. Decades of abuse catch up with the Octopus versus the 7th. The media who are supposed to inform us of such things failed to shine a light on this man's activities. Makes me think how many other despicable acts the media have concealed from us. What excuse is there for keeping such secrets? Shame. Leo O'Hagan, North Perth. And this lovely letter. Short, sharp shock, 5th of July 2014. I'm not sure if putting an 84-year-old man in jail for crimes he committed almost 50 years ago is justice. Punishment should have been carried out at the time in the form of a punch in the nose from the fathers of his young victims, or perhaps a slap in the face and a knee in the groin from his older victims. If Rolf had been taught those lessons early, perhaps his reign of terror would have been curtailed before it began. Mike Gallo, Golden Bay. And there were numerous other letters about Rolf Harris. So these two I picked particularly. So the first one is about, yes, why did the media not inform us of his predatory ways when, after his conviction, it became clear that actually a whole host of people had experienced unwanted sexual attention. Mainly, most of what came out was groping, and that he'd been doing this for decades, and that it was more or less an open secret within the entertainment industry. People were warned to stay away from him. And the question was, well, why didn't anybody do anything about it? And the answer is, of course, twofold. And the reason that the media didn't tell us any of this is because to publish things like that would have been slander or libel. Unless somebody was willing to come forward with a claim, which nobody was, then the media really can't publish that kind of thing. They couldn't even publish anonymous letters from people in the letters to the editor. Now, once he was convicted, of course, everybody's free to say these things. Not only are they free to say them, but the newspaper was free to publish it. Rolf Harris's reputation has now been tarnished so badly that no amount of publishing, claims that people were groped by him, is going to amount to libel. It's not going to do any damage to his reputation because the reputation's already ruined. And that's why this sudden floodgate, up until now, the media needed to have a credible source who was making credible allegations and who was willing to back it up in order to report it, and they simply didn't have it. And so there's a gap between things that people can whisper to each other in the back, behind closed doors, and the things that the media can actually report on. And the big gap is one of libel. And now, technically somebody telling somebody else to stay away from Rolf Harris because he's a bit of a groper is slanderous, but is almost certainly is very difficult to prove and so therefore we all happily gossip about each other, even though it's potentially slanderous under some reading of the law. Newspapers, on the other hand, or TV stations or whatever, are in much deeper waters if they choose to publish these. And as far as I can tell, the other part of it is that there essentially wasn't anybody willing to come forward and make a case. Now, I'd suggest there's probably a couple of reasons for that, but I would think that the main reason is because inevitably, in almost all sexual assault cases, people aren't willing to come forward and make allegations. We know that, the majority of sexual assault cases are not reported to the police. Rarely are they reported to any kind of authorities. And that's just a common run-of-the-mill type sexual assault cases. Now, you take that a step further, and you have somebody like Rolf Harris, who is a celebrity, or was a massive celebrity at the time. Less so more recently, and people obviously, for good reason, didn't want to come forward because they felt like they wouldn't be believed. It would be their word against his, and nobody would believe them. And we know that that's exactly the dynamics that we have with sexual assault cases. So I'm not surprised that nobody was willing to make a solid allegation, and therefore the media weren't in a position to be able to report any kind of allegations. And this idea that if had somebody stood up to him and given him a good whack when he was younger, it might have prevented him from becoming a serial sex offender. There is a slim possibility of that. I think it very unlikely. Firstly, I think that for much of his adult life, he was a well-respected entertainer. Even before that, he was a trainee teacher. He would have been in a position of authority with almost all of his victims. And we know that routinely these, kind of allegations aren't believed, and certainly weren't believed back 50 years ago. And so the idea that, had somebody who'd been groped by him told their father that their father would then go and assault Rolf Harris is unlikely. Much more likely would be that the person, telling their father that they'd been groped would get in trouble for it, which is what allowed him to get away with it. And the second thing is, we know that most people who are serial sex offenders quickly learn how to get away with it. They don't target the people whose fathers might come around and punch them in the face. They generally target the people that they know are vulnerable, don't have fathers necessarily, or, he was targeting his daughter's friend, somebody who was in a position of power and trust with, in a situation where they're on holiday. So again, outside of the normal routine. And certainly, and then eventually he became so famous and so internationally recognised that he obviously felt he could and was able to get away with essentially groping whoever he wanted. And so this simplistic suggestion that somebody should have, punched him when he was younger misses the point that he almost certainly wouldn't have been committing these offences against people for whom that was a risk. Anyway, enough about Rolf Harris. Last letter for today. Home Sweet Home, 5th of July, 2014. I fail to understand why the Corrections Department is prepared to spend thousands of dollars relocating a serial sex offender, time and time again if necessary, to find him a suitable place to stay, somewhere he can live his life in peace, free from public harassment and the threat of vigilante action. Don't come again, sex offender moved on after a community outcry 4th of the 7th. The perfect place for Mr. Come Again to live is obvious, Brian Dean Belmont. And by obvious, you are of course talking about prison. So for those of you who aren't in the state, we have a repeat sex offender who was recently released from jail. So the situation here is we have what's called the Dangerous Sex Offenders legislation. This means that somebody who is a repeat sex offender can be assessed by, I think it's a psychologist and a couple other experts, and the prosecutors then take them to court and they argue in front of a judge that this person poses an ongoing threat to the community. As a result, they then can get found to be a dangerous sex offender. This then allows the government to keep them in jail past their sentence date. So essentially what happens is repeat sex offenders, once they've been found to be a dangerous sex offender, they can serve out their sentence, they do their time, as it were, and when they get to the end of the sentence, they are then kept in jail indefinitely, not to be released. So, and this guy, Patrick Come Again, was one of these guys. He'd been. So what happens is they're kept indefinitely, but they are periodically reviewed. And as part of one of these review processes, it was found that he was suitable for re-release. He must have done things in prison or whatever, his risk of reoffending must have dropped to the point or something. Anyway, so he's found to be suitable for release. The Corrections Department then released him, but he's released under supervision. So he's not, it's not that they just let him out at the gate and shut the door and say, see you later. He is released into the community under the supervision of the Corrections Department, and that requires them essentially to make sure that he has a place to live. This guy in particular, I think most people it's required that they find a place to live. This guy might have had mental health issues, I'm not sure. He might have been intellectually impaired, I'm not sure. Anyway, so part of the onus then came down on the Corrections Department to ensure that he had a safe place to live, that he had... Unfortunately, he came from a small town. When he moved back there, it quickly became apparent to everybody who was there who he was, and there was an uproar. He was then moved on by the Corrections Department. They found him somewhere. They've apparently found him somewhere else to live. They haven't actually said where, and they're worried that he, may well come under threat of vigilante action. And people are genuinely and reasonably afraid, rationally afraid of him. He's got a long string of sexual offending. You essentially have to have that in order to be found to be a dangerous sexual offender. So the problem here is that, of course, people think that he should just be locked up forever. The problem with that is, one, it's illegal, and two, it's immoral. So firstly, it's illegal. There is no... the long-standing tradition is essentially that you do the crime, you do your time. And when you've done your time, you have served your sentence, and that you are essentially a free person. Now, over the last several decades, we have started to review that somewhat, and we've started to think that actually, and in a lot of countries actually, offending does carry somewhat of a life sentence with it. Even after you get out of jail, you'll have it on your record. This will have consequences long into the future for you. And so we've already backed away strongly from the idea of, do the crime, do your time. The idea of indefinite sentencing after you've served your sentence is one that I find particularly worrying. Essentially, the judge sentences you under the law of the land. And for some of these guys, I'm not sure about again, there's only a small handful of people who this affects, but that this legislation didn't exist at the time of their offending. So essentially, they were rational enough for us to convict them, for the community to say, yes, you understood what you're doing was wrong. So they're rational enough to weigh up the costs and benefits, essentially, to commit the crime knowing what the situation was. They then get sentenced. They then go to jail to serve their sentence. And then in the middle of their sentence, the laws are overhauled so that they then face the prospect of indefinite detention. Now, the reason why this hasn't really had much of an uproar is because these are sex offenders and nobody cares about sex offenders. But it is a very dangerous precedent to set, and our legal system is based on precedent. So the idea that you can indefinitely detain somebody for as an extension to their sentence without any kind of new crime having been committed is a very dangerous precedent. It's not a long bow to draw to imagine that you commit a crime, you go to jail, fully expecting to serve your sentence, and then not ever be let out again simply because some experts deem you to be a ongoing risk to the community. And part of the reason why this is such a dangerous precedent is because essentially what they're doing is they're sentencing this person for crimes he has not committed. The whole argument behind a ongoing risk and danger to the community is this idea that he is likely to commit future crimes. And by definition, future crimes are crimes he has not committed. So, by definition, he is being punished for things he has not done. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't take the safety of the community into account, but certainly we should be I think we should be a lot more worried about the dangers inherent in putting people in jail or keeping people in jail simply because we think that they are going to commit crimes in the future. The science behind that is the way that we come to these judgments that these people are a risk to the community is based on very shaky science. We are not very good we are very poor at predicting whether people will commit crimes. We certainly haven't got anywhere near the point where we could predict who the victim is going to be. And so these hypothetical crimes that he is, supposedly likely to commit remain very hypothetical. And in fact, there is something in our law that suggests that, and I want to talk about this for a little while. So essentially, when we talk about legal rights, or rights in general, there are two kinds of rights. There is the right to do things and the right to be free of things. Or the freedom to, or the freedom from, is the way that it's sometimes put. So essentially, if you have the freedom to speak freely, free speech, then you don't have the freedom from other people's speech. You can't have one. You can't have both. So you can't have everybody have the right to free speech, but at the same time be protected from hateful speech from other people. The two don't go together. And usually we strike a balance, so you're free to do all sorts of things, but you're also free from all sorts of things. But essentially, every society will have to work out more or less where on the spectrum they want to lie. And most Western democracies, well, almost all Western democracies, have come to the conclusion that it's better to be on the freedom to side of things. That is essentially that people have the liberty to do more or less most of the things that they choose to do, whether or not we agree with them, rather than preventing people from doing them in the first place. Other countries have, worked very much on a freedom from model, but the freedom from model, and this isn't might be sort of using a bit of emotional kind of stuff, but the freedom from model is certainly the Islamic model when it comes to women's rights. So the idea behind, say, the wearing of the headscarf is that this is protecting women, or not allowing them to go out in public by themselves, to always be chaperoned, is that's protecting them from sexual assault, sexual objectification, etc., etc. On the other hand, here in the West, we generally argue that they should have the freedom to do whatever they like, knowing full well that sometimes that will lead to them having negative consequences. Now, what's this got to do with Mr. Come Again and indefinite detention for sex offenders? Well, generally speaking, our society recognises that most people should have the right to commit crime. Now, that's not to say that they should be able to commit crime without consequences, but rather that we don't invest much time or effort in preventing individual people from committing individual crimes. We generally invest our effort in catching and convicting those who have committed crimes as a deterrent to people. But we generally recognise that most people, most of the time, should have the right to make poor decisions and commit crimes. We just want to encourage them not to access that right, as it were. We don't want to have a police state where people have the freedom from. So, for example, if you were if as a society we decided we should all be free from the perils of drink driving, then one solution would be to have mandatory alcohol breath lockouts in all cars. And that would go a long way to providing us all the freedom from drink drivers. As a society, we've decided that's actually a bit crazy, that we don't really value that freedom from all that much. What we would rather have is the freedom for people to make the poor decision to drink drive, but to have a whole pile of intervention essentially targeted at people to try and convince them not to take up that choice. And that's the same with the sex offenders, is that generally speaking, most of us have the means and the opportunity to commit sex offences most of our lives. Very few of us have the motivation to do so, but most of us men in particular, have the means and the opportunity to do so. There is not a lot stopping us. Not a lot externally stopping us. And the idea that just because somebody has a pattern of offending, that this is therefore enough to deny them the right to choose in the future, essentially. That we are going to deny them the right to even make the choice to behave well, is worrisome. Now, you may well be screaming at your monitor at the moment saying, but what about the victims, and how, what if it was your child? And I completely agree. I think because I'm removed from it, I can think about some of these moral issues a bit strongly. I also think there is a bit of a slippery slope here. Now, I know that's a fallacy, and so I think there is a direct causal link. Essentially, there are moves in some jurisdictions, I believe the UK has it already, to extend the laws from repeat sexual offenders to repeat violent offenders. So if you've committed a number of violent offences, you have a pattern of violent behaviour, that then you can be detained indefinitely, essentially, until you can convince the courts that you are no longer at risk. And some people say, well, yeah, that's fair enough. Essentially, once you've established a precedent, it is easier to roll it out. Once you can establish that you can indefinitely detain someone, it's easier to roll it out to other criminal offending, as long as you can show that there's the same level of victimhood, say. It wouldn't be, in some societies, it wouldn't be a hard sell to extend that to drug dealers. And then in some societies like the US, drug dealing can involve very small quantities of drugs. And so yes, there's a slippery slope argument, and I know that that can be a fallacy. I guess I'm suggesting here that it's not absolutely that we're going to go down that line, but certainly every step we take does make it easier to go down the next step. Anyway, that's it. That's my whinge for this week. Hope you're all doing well, and I'll see you next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See you later.